I want to welcome you to our first State of Democracy lecture of the year. I'm Grant Reher, Director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute at the Maxwell School here, and I'm very pleased to welcome back to Maxwell our former student, Michael Kranish. But as I was telling Michael on the way in from the airport, I had wanted to invite him here before I discovered that he was an alum. So it's a straight-up invitation that we have here for you today, Michael. Before I turn the floor over to my colleague, Bob McClure, I want to offer some thanks to the Dean's Office for supporting the series and for technical support, the Information and Computing Technology Group, and in particular, Tom Fazio. Thanks as well to my colleague, Elizabeth Cohen, who helps organize the series, and Bethany Wallawender and Kelly Coleman, who work in the Institute and help put together these events. While I have you here, let me also invite you to another lecture that's coming up in a different series. On October 24th, the political philosopher and public intellectual Michael Sandel will deliver our second Tanner lecture on ethics, citizenship, and public responsibility. It will be in this room at 6 o'clock. Now, today with Michael, we will depart slightly from our traditional format for the State of Democracy lectures. Michael will speak, and then we'll move directly to the Q&A. And this is because we are assuming that you're going to have lots of questions for him about Mitt Romney. And then, of course, we'll continue the conversation out in, not out in the foyer. Actually, I have something to say about that in a second, but we will continue the conversation with a reception over food and drink. So I have finally 4 important announcements here. The reception that I just mentioned will not take place in the foyer as it normally does, but it will be in the public events room of Eggers Hall, the building that adjoins this one, in room 220. Just follow us if you're not sure where to go. The reason for that is there is another event that's going to be outside in the foyer here. Second, Michael's books will be available for purchase and signing at that reception. Third, if you are tweeting his lecture, please use the following hashtag, SOD Kranish. You can tell we're not in Britain. That wouldn't go over too well there. And then fourth, before you fire up your tweet delivery device, I would like to ask you to silence your cell phones and other devices. And this is true even if you're cool enough to have an iPhone 5 already. Turn them all off. And now to introduce Michael, I want to turn the floor over to Bob McClure. He's the Chappell Family Professor of Citizenship and Democracy Emeritus and a political science professor here at the Maxwell School. Bob?
Well, it's most fitting that this year's Democracy Lecture Series begins with Michael Kranish. Our guest, his father, both were members of the Newspaper Guild. And he practices a craft central to the life of a free people. He's a journalist, an honest-to-God, shoe-leather, beat-trudging reporter. He digs up information, turning over rock after rock, and reports what he finds underneath. Just reports what he finds, mind you. No blabber, no slant, dull, straight, written down news. How quaint, how important. Look at him. Look at him. There is an endangered species. Democracy needs independent scribblers like Michael, but he and his craftsman colleagues are under attack from all sides, and their business base is under siege by constant tweets and little twits, opinion entertainers from left and right masquerading as real journalists and dealing in inflammatory soundbite bullshit that we, the people, keep on buying. We and democracy are going to miss Michael when he's gone. So listen up today. Take a long, close look. Perhaps even shed a tear. You may never see his likes again. Michael began his career in 1979 as a City Hall reporter in Lakeland, Florida, learning his craft the old-fashioned way, from the ground up, story by story, and interview by interview. He then moved to the Miami Herald as an urban affairs reporter. In 1984, he joined the Boston Globe, where he has remained for 28 years, currently serving as the deputy chief of the Washington Bureau. Along the way, he was a business writer, congressional reporter, White House correspondent, national reporter, and investigative reporter. He's covered Bush 41, Clinton, Kerry, McCain, and Romney. Now, where I come from, we'd say, that old boy sure has been around the barn a time or two. This afternoon, we are all the beneficiaries of all that mucking about. In 2008, Michael was a residential fellow at the International Center for Jefferson Studies at Monticello, where he researched and wrote a first-rate, very well-received history of Thomas Jefferson as a Revolutionary War governor in Virginia. The book, Flight from Monticello, Thomas Jefferson at War, was published in 2010 by the Oxford University Press. Our speaker presents this afternoon the lessons learned from his more recently published biography of Mitt Romney, The Real Romney, co-authored with one of his Globe colleagues and published by HarperCollins. In 2004, he co-authored another presidential biography about another Massachusetts politician, John Kerry. As Grant said, Michael is one of our own. He graduated from Syracuse University in 1979 with a degree in journalism and political science. In 1976, this young man survived and indeed overcame a classroom encounter with yours truly. Then a very young and just tenured associate professor who was also learning his craft in the trenches in an introductory American government course in this very auditorium. Michael sat back there. With pride and delight, I'm pleased to participate in this enactment of the Circle of Life. Honored to introduce a graceful writer, thoughtful man, and a damn fine independent journalist, Michael Kranish. Welcome home, Michael.
Wow, I don't think I can top that, but thank you so much, Professor McClure. It's such an honor to be back in this classroom, which I remember so well as one of the most extraordinary educational opportunities that I had here at Syracuse. I want to start with a story actually that begins more than 60 years ago. There was a reporter at the Daily Orange who left his fraternity one evening and he wanted to see a play that was being performed here at Syracuse. The name of the play was Electra. And he reviewed the play for the Daily Orange, and he wrote about how one poet in particular was, quote, magnificent, unquote. And lo and behold, his friend said, would you like to meet the person who you just wrote this glowing review of? And he said yes. And I'm very thankful that he did, because if my father had not written about my mother those years ago, I would not be standing here today. And my time, as I mentioned, my time here in this room and going to Syracuse, I started actually when I was 16 years old. I was a pre-college student. I very much wanted to go to Syracuse. My ambition was to be a political reporter, and my two daughters are always saying, you know, we're not like you. We didn't know what we wanted to do when we were 11 years old. But I knew very early that I wanted to be a political reporter, and I decided very early that the way to do that was to come here to Syracuse and do that double major. So fortunately for me, it worked out, and it's really been a big part of my life, and it's a really special moment to come back here to Syracuse. Let me tell you one of the things that is on my mind. I want to talk mostly about Mitt Romney, but I want to start a little bit broader since the theme of the series is the state of democracy. And when I was a student here, the media was so different. And I remember talking back and forth, maybe it was in this class, about how the media could be a gatekeeper, how the public needed more information to make informed decisions. And there were various media entities that control the information too much, and the general public wouldn't know about things that they needed to know to make information. And now fast forward all these years later, and we have this proliferation of information, tweets, blogs, online. You could know almost as much as a reasonably informed political reporter in Washington if you were in a desert with an internet connection and an open mind to get all sorts of points of views. Obviously, one of the things that people are concerned about today is that people view things through the tunnel of thought they have. They have a certain viewpoint, and they tune into the channel that fits their viewpoint. And the way I was raised as a journalist by my father and taught here was that we need to provide the best information. We don't want to be certainly a gatekeeper, but now that the floodgates have opened so much, I still think there's a need for traditional journalism that helps people make a decision without having, as Professor McClure mentioned, a slant from the beginning. And that's the idea behind trying to write a full-scale biography. My paper, the Boston Globe, many others write stories by the hour and sometimes by the minute about all sorts of things in the campaign, the horse race nature of the campaign. But what we also need is a full-scale understanding of who the candidate is. And that's always what's interested me. How did a person become the person they are? How is their character shaped? What are the key moments in that person's life that shaped them and helped them make decisions that were key to the person that they are now and telling us something, perhaps providing a clue about what they might do if they become president? What shaped that person? And to do that, my view is that you really need a full-scale biography that uses the information that's out there and then starts from scratch and really tries to understand that person in an unbiased way. And at the Boston Globe, we had great resources to do that. We had other reporters who participated. I had a co-author and other people who contributed, really taking advantage of many, many, many years of reporting. As Professor McClure mentioned, I previously wrote a book called Flight from Monticello about Thomas Jefferson. And I want to mention that just for a minute because obviously that is synonymous with democracy in a lot of ways, what happened with him. And in a paragraph, or as they call it, the elevator pitch, the story of that book is that Thomas Jefferson, 5 years after authoring the Declaration of Independence, was the governor of Virginia in flight from the British, in flight, in fact, from the traitor Benedict Arnold, who led a fleet of ships with 1,600 men who were chasing him across Virginia. He had to flee the capital of Richmond. Eventually, when other British came in, he had to flee from Monticello. Our democracy was not so easily created, and it was not simply a done deal in 1776. Here was Jefferson 5 years later on the run, in hiding, really, from the British when he left the governorship and left Virginia without leadership. And the reason I mention that is not simply to talk about a book that I wrote, it's to remind everyone that how democracy develops and how the fights among the candidates have developed. Jefferson, after this wrenching experience, said that he never wanted to run for political office. He wanted to leave that realm. He said that his wounds would only be healed by the grave. And yet, a few years later, some years later, he ran for the presidency. He believed that John Adams was too federalist, and he was concerned, Jefferson was, that there would be this return to monarchical ways. And Jefferson said when he won the election of 1800 that, quote, the reign of witches, unquote, has ended. So think about that. Think about what Jefferson himself had to go through, and he felt even after we'd been created, after he'd suffered all that he had and had been on the run from the British and then decided he needed to run for president. He needed to endure a presidential campaign in which he was called a coward, in which he was vilified for all sorts of things. Nonetheless, he ran for the presidency, and after he left the presidency, a number of people who were his successors were called Jeffersonians because they followed his way of thinking. As contradictory as a man as he was, given that he owned slaves and said that all men are created equal, he is a person that we still to this day talk about. So now let me bring it forward to this campaign where lots of things are held about that actually in some ways are not as tough as what Jefferson had to endure, but nonetheless, it's an extremely, extremely tough campaign where every minute you have ads running, you have things being put throughout the media. I heard last week or 2 weeks ago an Obama campaign official talk about the extraordinary ubiquity of the television commercials. And he related the story of talking to a 3-year-old. I don't know if it was his 3-year-old or someone else, but he told the story of how an Obama campaign commercial showed up on the television. And the person asked the 3-year-old, "Do you know who that is?" And the 3-year-old responded, "Barack Obama." And the person said to the 3-year-old, "Do you know what he does?" And the 3-year-old responded, "He approves this message." So what did the rest of us learn? From all that we gather, the proliferation of information, what did we learn? Let me tell you a little about what I've learned in researching Mitt Romney. The Boston Globe, as I mentioned, has been covering him for 18 years. And in 2007, I was part of a team of reporters who did a 7-part series that talked about his life. And so we used that then as a backbone to start researching this book. And what I learned is that Mitt Romney is many things. People say, well, you've written this book, it's called The Real Romney. Who is the real Romney? And the answer is that he has been many different things throughout his life, and understanding how he's developed is key to understanding who he is. So let me go now to 1964. Mitt Romney is 17 years old. He's with his father in San Francisco, and they're attending the Republican National Convention. Some people have tried to put George Romney, Mitt's father, up as a candidate for the presidency, but Barry Goldwater clearly is going to be the nominee. George Romney is very concerned about the direction of the party becoming so conservative. Barry Goldwater, for example, had voted against the civil rights legislation in 1964. So with Mitt watching, George proposes to the platform committee a plank that says that the party rejects extremism, quote unquote. And the platform committee rejects that. He asked the platform committee to adopt language that's supportive of civil rights legislation. The committee rejects that. And as Mitt Romney later told the story, his father, quote, walked out of the Republican convention because he was concerned that they were becoming so conservative. He said, if we nominate Barry Goldwater, then the Republican Party will be committing, quote, political suicide. Of course, we know what happened. The party did nominate Barry Goldwater, and Goldwater decisively lost that election. So what did Mitt Romney learn from that? He watched his father then 4 years later run for the presidency. Mitt was then a missionary in France for the Mormon Church, but he very closely followed the clippings and followed what was going on with his father's campaign. And you all probably know the moment when George Romney made this famous or infamous comment in an interview about Vietnam. George Romney had been very supportive of the Vietnam War, but then he changed his mind, and he had said he'd gotten the greatest brainwashing, quote unquote, from the generals over there that you could imagine. And that and other factors eventually caused George Romney to have to drop out of the 1968 presidential race before the first primary was held in New Hampshire. So Mitt learned a big lesson from this. He learned, and his sister Jane is quoted in the book, she told another Globe reporter some years ago, that as a result of that Mitt is very careful in what he says, that he's very scripted in what he says. And I think it gives you insight into, people ask the question all the time, why does he have trouble connecting and so forth? He saw his father lose his presidential ambition in part because of one sentence uttered in a television interview when his father was speaking frankly. And many historians would say that his father was right about what happened in Vietnam and what was the solution to what was going on in Vietnam. But at the time, of course, that was a difficult argument to make. Over the years, as Mitt Romney watched his father, and his father faded from national life, he was served as the Secretary of Housing and Urban Development in the Nixon administration. And Mitt Romney, he wanted to have a business career like his father. At first, he thought, I'll go into business like my father did. His father was the very successful chairman of the American Motors Corporation. And it was after that his father had served as the governor in Michigan and run for the presidency. So Mitt Romney decided that that's what he would do. He would be a business person, and that's his background. He didn't run for the mayor's seat. He didn't run for city council. He didn't learn all of the local political skills that you might learn if you were a more typical candidate. Mitt Romney grew up, as we say in the book, in a series of bubbles. This included growing up in Bloomfield Hills, one of the wealthiest communities in the country. It included growing up in the Mormon Church, a rather small religion, especially in Michigan. And it included going on the Mormon mission that I mentioned. So having this vision and then attending Harvard Business School and Harvard Law School simultaneously, which was an extraordinarily difficult thing to do in a new program at the time, he decided to stay in Boston, and he got a job very quickly with a consulting company. Now, I mentioned his father working for American Motors. His father clearly did turn around American Motors Corporation in part by basing his plans on a gas-efficient car called the Rambler. Mitt Romney was in a different sort of business. He was a business consultant, and he worked for a company called Bain and Company that advised various firms on how to improve their bottom line. And there came a day when the founder of Bain and Company, Bill Bain, had a meeting with Mitt Romney, and he said, "You're very smart. We would like to put you in charge of a new company called Bain Capital. And that company will not just advise other firms, you will invest in other firms, and you can make an awful lot more money." And Mitt Romney, being very cautious by nature, said no, that he had a growing family, he was making a lot of money with Bain and Company, that he didn't want to do this. And Bill Bain upped the offer. He said, "Well, I'll tell you what, if you will take this job and it doesn't work out, I'll bring you back to Bain and Company. You'll get all the raises you would have gotten otherwise. In essence, you can't lose." And at that point, Mitt Romney decided that he would go ahead and enter this venture and take over, found Bain Capital. And that's what he did. It wasn't a typical founding of a small business. I know it's portrayed that way sometimes, but it was a very unusual way to start what became a very successful business. But at first, they didn't know if it would be successful. It certainly was a leap, because this kind of business was not being done before. So one of the big investments, and I'll just briefly talk about Bain Capital, one of the biggest early investments was in a company called Staples, which everyone probably is familiar with, and you may have gone to the store many times. This was when Mitt Romney was in the venture capital business, and he was helping to start up a business. It's a company that he talks about all the time. They put in $2.5 million, and eventually they got out $13 million. That's a good profit, but when you look at the overview like we did of 15 years and 100 deals at Bain Capital, it's striking that it's actually one of the smallest deals that Mitt Romney did, although it's one of the deals he talks about the most. What struck me is that in looking over all of these deals with a colleague of mine at the Globe, we saw that pretty quickly he shifted from venture capital work to what's known as leveraged buyouts, a more controversial type of business in which you are going into a company that already exists, maybe actually doing okay, telling them to take out various loans, put debt in that company, and giving them advice on how to change their company. Sometimes you would advise them to shut down factories to be more efficient. Sometimes jobs were created. It goes back and forth. But the bottom line is the leveraged buyout business is where he actually made most of his money. So let me give you one example that we came across in the research for the book. And that is that there was a partner in Italy, and this person in Italy said, "We have a suggestion that you invest in what sounds like a very boring enterprise, the Italian version of the Yellow Pages." And this was before the internet was really booming, and they really didn't see it as a big payoff, but they decided to go ahead and invest in the Italian Yellow Pages business. Obviously, this does not involve the creation of jobs in the US and so forth. And Mitt Romney actually was skeptical about internet plays. He did not invest in a number of internet companies because, correctly, he worried that there would be a bust after the ongoing boom that was going on. But in this case, the Yellow Pages company did turn into an internet-type company. It was sort of quickly the Italian version of America Online, not just the Yellow Pages. And lo and behold, that $50 million turned into $1 billion. And in this one deal, Mitt Romney made $30 million. Partners give various estimates, but it may be one of the very most profitable deals for Mitt Romney personally. And it's a very different type of deal, obviously, than investing in Staples. So I just give those to give some balance to what actually happened at Bain Capital. There were a lot of deals that we write about in the book, but those are two at different ends of the scale, both very important to Mitt Romney. Obviously, the latter one is not one that he talks about on the campaign trail, but it is one of the major reasons that he became very wealthy. So after being successful at Bain Capital, Mitt Romney had an audacious idea. And that idea was to run for the U.S. Senate, not just any U.S. Senate seat, but the seat held by the liberal lion, Ted Kennedy. He wasn't sure about this at first, but his wife, Ann, as she often did throughout his life and continues to do, said, if you don't do this, you'll always regret it. So he decided to take the leap. And the Mitt Romney of 1994 was a very different person than the Mitt Romney of today. He described himself as an independent. He boasted that he had voted for Paul Zongas in the 1992 Democratic primary in Massachusetts. Paul Zongas, a Democrat, of course, the former senator from Massachusetts. And he supported abortion rights. He said he was better on gay rights than Ted Kennedy. He rejected Newt Gingrich's contract with America, which was just being proposed at the time of this race. So he was well to the left of the Republican Party, but of course he's running against the liberal lion. So that's what he had to do, you might say, looking back, to try to be competitive. And he was fairly competitive, but he was surprised when Ted Kennedy started attacking Mitt Romney's career at Bain Capital, started running ads that if you took out who was the opponent, are almost identical to ads being run today against Mitt Romney on Bain Capital. It talks about him being a form of a vulture capitalist and factories being shut and so forth. And Mitt Romney, for whatever reason, was surprised by this attack, did not respond effectively to it, and of course he lost that race. What did he learn from that? Well, he went back to Bain Capital, and these were the real boom years of Bain Capital. He made tens, if not hundreds of millions of dollars. And then, when the opportunity came in 2002 to run for the governorship, he decided to run again. And he wasn't running against a Ted Kennedy, he was running against lesser-known individuals. And in this race, he portrayed himself as a moderate, which is his word. He called himself a progressive, his word again. And he was successful, and he won the governorship. He hadn't even run on a platform of instituting health care for the citizens of Massachusetts, which of course includes an individual mandate. This was something he came up with later, and he decided to put this through, working with a legislature that was 85% Democratic. So without question, this is Mitt Romney's greatest political accomplishment. Putting aside Bain Capital, maybe it's one of his greatest accomplishments. Of course, as we all know, in the presidential primaries in the GOP, it's not something that he wanted to talk about in great detail because other Republicans were criticizing that legislation because they did not like the federal version of that legislation. The federal version, of course, was modeled to a degree on what happened in Massachusetts. So we see Mitt Romney further shaping a more moderate image. In fact, when he signed the health care legislation, he did so with none other than Ted Kennedy standing behind him. Ted Kennedy was applauding as this legislation was signed, and the story is told that later on, one of Mitt Romney's sons who was there said that to watch Mitt Romney sign that legislation with Ted Kennedy, the former opponent, clapping in the background, well, Mitt Romney's son thought, maybe we've also solved climate change because hell just froze over. This was the Mitt Romney of 2002 and the Mitt Romney that the citizens of Massachusetts came to know. He was a pretty moderate, pragmatic figure. During Romney's governorship, he decided to pursue an ambition that he'd had for a long time. If you've heard Mitt Romney talk, he said that he never expected to be running for president, but that's a surprise to people who've known him for years, who felt that he really imagined for a long time trying to succeed where his father had failed. So while they're considering this, of course, the topic comes up, how can you win the Republican primaries if you are a moderate who supports abortion rights and comes from liberal Massachusetts? So whether it's a coincidence or not, during his governorship, he had an epiphany and he opposed abortion rights, the details of which are all explained in the book. And he gradually became and portrayed himself as more conservative. In fact, the healthcare legislation he felt was a conservative accomplishment. While now it's viewed as a rather liberal measure, or certainly a moderate measure, he felt by requiring individuals to have to get health insurance that was personal responsibility, which was a big movement within the conservative thinking. So he didn't look at it as a liberal accomplishment. He thought it was an accomplishment that all sides could agree on, and was somewhat surprised that it would eventually be criticized so heavily. But he did become more conservative in the way, certainly, that he portrayed himself. In running for the presidency in 2008, though, he had never done this before. He had a lot of lessons to learn, and he felt that his accomplishments, his success in business, his success in passing health care, that these were really key, important things. He knew that his Mormon religion would be questioned by some evangelicals who are prominent in the GOP, but he felt he could overcome that. So shortly after passing the healthcare legislation, Romney walked across Boston Common and went up to the top of the Ritz-Carlton Hotel in Boston. And there awaiting him was a group of political leaders from the Republican Party of Iowa, which of course is the first caucus state. And he sat down with them and he explained, here's why I want to run for president. And he thought the Iowans were basically already on board. Otherwise, why would they be there? But the Iowa political Republicans were realists. They knew what it took to win in Iowa and how difficult it could be. And so one of the members of the Iowa party said he had some questions for Mitt Romney. He started to challenge Mitt Romney. How are you going to connect with people? How are you going to convince people who are skeptical of Mormonism that they should accept you? And he went on and on with these questions. And according to this person from Iowa, that Ann Romney, Mitt's wife, got so upset that she walked out of the room because she was so upset by some of these questions, particularly about religion and things like that. And later, they went over to the Boston Garden to watch a collegiate basketball game. And this person said he sat next to Mitt Romney, but it was the coldest shoulder I ever had. Didn't talk during the entire time. Nonetheless, this Iowa person thought, you know what? out of all the people, Mitt Romney's still the best person to be the nominee. So he went to work for Mitt Romney in Iowa, and unfortunately what happened from Mitt Romney's standpoint was that their campaign plan did not work. They thought if they could win what's called the straw poll in Iowa in the summer before the caucus and win over a lot of evangelicals, that they would win the caucuses. And what happened was he spent a lot of money, and in the end he lost the straw vote and they lost the caucuses to Mike Huckabee, and his campaign was effectively over. It went on, but he never recovered from what happened in Iowa. So this time around, he ran a different race. He didn't participate in the straw poll at all. He didn't spend much money in Iowa until the very end when he saw an opening, and then he thought he'd won, but of course in the end there was a recount, and Rick Santorum was successful. But he had learned his lessons from the last campaign, and he pretty quickly went on against, frankly, a pretty weak field to become the nominee of the party. So as we see, he still faces some of the same challenges he's always faced throughout his career. He still faces some questions about whether he can connect with people. And when people use this phrase, it's sort of a catchphrase, but what it means is, does he understand the problems of average people? Does he get it? Does he get me and you? Does he get the average everyday person's problems, what they're going through? How does a person who's worth at least $250 million, who hasn't led an average life by any means, really understand what it means to have difficulties, to worry about money and so forth? We saw a turn in Mitt Romney's efforts to address this question in the convention. They came up with the idea that after many months of really not talking about Romney's religion, they would find a way to talk about it without talking about the tenets of his faith, but to talk about what he did as a leader of a group of churches in Massachusetts. It's called a stake. It's sort of like a diocese, and the group of churches have a lay leader, and that person was Mitt Romney for a number of years. It was like a second job. And during that time, as some people told it, Mitt Romney would help people far less advantaged than him, help people from various walks of life. And according to Romney and those who he helped, that was the way that he understood more average problems. It took Mitt Romney quite a long time in many campaigns to talk about that a little more openly, and this was addressed in the convention with some people who were helped by him speaking at the convention. However, as it turned out, those people talked. I was there. I think it was between 8 and 9 o'clock in the evening when most people probably weren't watching television. And then in prime time, they saw Clint Eastwood talking to an empty chair. So I'm not sure if the message got out that they wanted to get out, but you can see as he's gone towards the general election that he's tried to answer some of these questions. He still obviously has a long way to go. There are polls, but the polls 2 months out from Election Day, it's really hard to know what to make of things because there's a bounce from the election. There's this bump and that bump. The race is still pretty close in about, I'd say, 10 states. So we have a long way to go, really, to see what will happen as people learn about who Mitt Romney really is. Thank you very much.
So we've got questions about Mitt Romney. I think there was one over here we'll start with, and then we'll go around.
Hello. I've read your book. It's very, very good. And there's a question that it didn't answer that I would like you to address. And I don't mean to be deliberately provocative, but I'm really curious. After all of your following of Mitt Romney, from the beginning of his career in Massachusetts to the present, do you believe that he is a man with any principles?
Well, this is a question I get all the time, variations of the question. That's really the name of the book, who is he really? And, and I'll be honest, as a reporter, art, especially still working for the Boston Globe, we try very hard not to impose an opinion, but give you the best information that we can, because it's, if you get that question to people on both sides, they'll give, very strong answers. And the question is asked, does he have core convictions? How could he be for abortion rights one day and then be strongly against abortion rights on another day? Call himself a moderate and independent during the time of Reagan Bush, and now call himself severely conservative. So it's a very, very legitimate question. There's no question about whether he has changed his views. That's undeniable. The question is why he has changed his views on some things. Is it because he's had epiphanies, heartfelt changes of mind, or is he trying to keep up with a party that also is changing dramatically? As I mentioned earlier, the party of Mitt Romney's father is hardly the party, the party that George Romney hoped it would be, is hardly the party that Mitt Romney is seeing today. It's even more conservative than it was back in 1964 in some ways. So I feel it's not a question for me to say directly he does or he doesn't. What I feel is my job to do as a biographer and a reporter is to show you step by step how it is, and as you've read, that he has changed quite significantly in his views and is running as a very different politician. One of the things I do say in the book is that I describe people talking about him with his business background being a market-based person. To be successful in business, of course, you have to understand your market, and in particular, you need to understand where the market's going and how the market is changing and how the customer is changing. One day they're using your razor and the next day they're not. What do you do to keep up? And so some people who know Mitt Romney well say that applies to him in politics. And they would say that one person described him as a driven pragmatist, that he knew the market for being elected in Massachusetts in 1994 was to be a liberal to moderate politician, and that the market to be a Republican presidential nominee in this year was to be, quote, severely conservative. So that's what some people would say, and as he governed in Massachusetts, it was more pragmatic, it was less ideological. I mean, that's just the way he's viewed. Obviously, he worked with a very heavily Democratic legislature. If he's elected president, it might depend quite a bit on the makeup of the legislature to see how he would react.
Stephanie, you've got the
To follow up on that, you just said that your job is to report.
Right.
And do you see it as, is it your job to write the next book to say, why is that? Is that for academia to do, to say, why do we have a system or an electorate that requires this kind of contortion and dancing to get elected? Certainly that isn't the case when you spin the globe and you look around the democracies around the world. There's some of that, but the degree that that's happened in the United States is just, it's laughable. And you're reporting on that, but how about the assessment of it? Does that come from people like you, or does that come from people like on either side of you? Thank you.
Right. Well, I mean, politicians, I've covered a lot of politicians over the years, and I have to say probably all of them have changed positions over the years. I'm not excusing anything, but I'm just saying, giving you a blunt fact that we can go back time and time again with various politicians and say, wait, you said read my lips, no new taxes, and you raise taxes, and so forth, right on through now. That is part of a reporter's job, is to point out they've changed their positions. Do we need to go further and say, that's terrible? I think our job is to very clearly lay out, here's what the person said before, here's what they're saying now, and as best we know, why they're saying that and what might be, part of the reason for them saying that.
question over here.
Yes, I understand that Romney did not seek re-election for governor. He only had one term.
Right.
Can you explain why he decided not to run? And also, a quick question: is there any way we can find out about all those missing years that he refuses to divulge his tax returns on?
Right. So two questions. On the first question, he has said he did not want to run for re-election. He didn't seek re-election. Clearly, during his governorship, he was establishing a series of committees that put him in, set him up basically to run for the presidency. There were committees around the country. So whether he decided not to run because he had already decided to run for the presidency, we just know what happened. I mean, the facts are there. He served one term, didn't seek re-election, and promptly sought the presidency. That's what happened. As far as the tax returns, let me go back to the 1994 race. During that campaign, Mitt Romney was trying to cast Ted Kennedy as the wealthy person who wouldn't release his taxes. He said if Ted Kennedy has nothing to hide, he should release his taxes. And if Ted Kennedy does release his taxes, then I'll release my taxes. It was like two kids at the schoolyard. Ted Kennedy said, no, I'm not going to release my taxes. And Mitt Romney said, okay, well, then I'm not going to release my taxes. So for 18 years, the Boston Globe, among other institutions, has been asking him to release his taxes. Since he opened the door, he set the paradigm for this issue, not Harry Reid or someone else. He set this paradigm up in 1994 by saying, what have you got to hide? Why aren't you releasing your taxes? In 2002, when he ran for the governorship, his opponents were releasing their taxes. So they said, okay, last time you said if your opponent releases your taxes, you would, and he refused. He said, I'm paraphrasing, that I made a mistake by saying that I should release my taxes then. it's a matter of privacy, and I'm not going to list my taxes even if my opponents do. I'm paraphrasing, but that's what happened. So he did change his, talking about change of positions, he did change his position, on that. And that's something when people ask me about that, that's part of my role. It's like, okay, I know the history. I actually know what happened, going back. It's not a new question. It's a question that's been around. So then it begs the question, okay, why won't he release his taxes for all those years? Because he won't answer, it lets people speculate. He's made a calculation, obviously, that maybe there's more harm in releasing them than harm from people speculating about why he won't release them. What we do know is that the years from 1984 through 99 or 2002, depending on how you calculate it, he was running Bain Capital, except when he was briefly running for governor and briefly going back to help rescue Bain and Company, the other company where he'd come from. And during that time, he was making tens or hundreds of millions of dollars. We don't know for those years what tax rate he was paying. We don't know for those years whether there were certain calculations within the returns that might tell us, okay, there's a deal in which he made a lot of money, and that deal resulted in something perhaps negative happening at a company that he made a profit from. We know what he made, generally speaking, in profits from Bain Capital, but when it comes to more specifics, there's a lot of things that we don't know. I know some of them because I know them from partners of his, but even their estimates are only estimates extrapolated from what happened with their finances, not directly, regarding Mitt Romney. So it is a question that goes back quite a lot. I mentioned this period from 84 to 2002. After that period, he had a 10-year severance deal, which was not a typical severance deal. It was a very lucrative benefits package, which expired. And really, he's released taxes for 2010 and is going to release, he says, for 2011. But those 2 years don't tell us an awful lot about what happened at Bain Capital. So if people think that's an important issue, that's the reason probably that it is, a valid issue if you go back to what Mitt Romney himself said in 1994.
What you must have looked into his business, when you looked into his business career, always something about him that struck me as kind of interesting. There's clearly he's a smart guy, but was his business success due because he was surrounded by a lot of smart people, and was he more lucky or skillful when you talked to his colleagues? I mean, did they attribute the success to Bain to really Romney and his abilities, or was he just a lucky guy who was in the right place at the right time?
I think if you talk to some of his partners and you ask that question, they would probably say the answer is yes to a number of those things that you said, that a lot of those things, are not contradictory, that a lot of them are true. Clearly, the time that he was at Bain Capital, a lot of that coincided with an extraordinary boom in the stock market. It's also fair to say that Mitt Romney was the final sign-off on these deals. The deal failed, he was the ultimate person responsible. If the deal succeeded, he was rewarded very, very handsomely. We looked at 100 deals over a 15-year period when he was primarily running Bain Capital. And what we found, I worked with a colleague who's a business reporter on this, and we felt it was the first time that a full look had been done, because people look at a couple of companies usually. What we found was that, and you have to understand how Bain Capital works. Let me back up. Bain Capital is sort of like a super, mutual fund, if you will. It is an investment fund, and they go out and ask very wealthy people to put their money in this investment fund. Typically, you might need about $1 million in the kitty to be accepted, sometimes more. So it was a fund for very, very wealthy investors, obviously. Mitt Romney's fiduciary responsibility was to make those very wealthy investors wealthier. That was his job. That was his job. One of his books, of course, is called Turnaround, but Mitt Romney has also said, I think actually in that same book, that he didn't actually go in and run these companies. That was left to management. And if you watch a 30-second ad, what I just said might not be entirely clear to you. I'm not saying it in a negative or positive way. I'm just trying to give you a more realistic sense of what he did. He ran an investment fund. On a couple occasions, he was on a board, and he might have had even more input. He might have said, why don't we suggest the company do this or do that? But he wasn't in there running those companies. He was running Bain Capital, and then he went back when Bain and Company was failing. He did turn around that company, but that's different. It was a company that he previously worked at that's obviously tied into his employment. As to the question about whether he was lucky, certainly in some cases he was. In the book, I quote one of his partners as saying that there was a deal, I mentioned the Yellow Pages of Italy earlier, And one of his partners who profited handsomely from that deal said that wasn't like being hit by the lucky stick, that was being thrashed by it. So in some cases, luck, but you have to make your own luck. I mean, if Mitt Romney hadn't said, yes, let's invest in the Italian Yellow Pages, not knowing it would be such a big success, he wouldn't have made any money from it. So you have to be fair and look at it, in both ways. But again, this wasn't Mitt Romney going in and running that company. He made the decision that the investment fund would invest in it, and the timing was very good. Later on, that company, after they cashed out, had some problems of another nature. So as far as his partners, he brought in the partners. They, I've interviewed a lot of them, as have my colleagues. They're universally hailed as extremely smart, some of the best in the business, and they didn't want to go to Wall Street. They wanted to work in Boston. They had a similar mindset in that they liked the idea of being a little bit away from the hubbub of Wall Street and running this company, Bain Capital, out of Boston, which obviously today is a very successful company. It's a different question. So to answer more directly, those partners brought in a lot of good deals, made a lot of decisions that Romney, as the founder and sole shareholder, benefited from tremendously. There are some cases where Romney himself brought in some deals to the table, and a number of those deals failed. One of his partners told us that they would sometimes grimace when Romney came in with his own idea, because those ideas sometimes didn't work out so well, such as an investment in a doll company in which the doll was supposed to look like the child that the doll was being given to. It didn't work out very well. Romney actually put up some of his own funds to try to help the company out, but it just didn't work out. The partners knew that wasn't his strength, that his strength was to sort of let the partners argue out, why don't we do this, why don't we do that? He saw his job sort of like in a Harvard, review class at law school or business school, what are some questions, and then letting the argument be waged back and forth, and sometimes not telling them at the table, what his view was. Sometimes he would want to go afterwards, one by one of the partners, talking to them. So it's a different management style. It wasn't, as heavy-handed as it is the case in some other business. That was what they called the Bain way. That was his style, and it's certainly for him personally. He benefited. Were there companies that they invested in where people lost their jobs? Yes. Were there companies that succeeded, more than they might have otherwise? Yes. How many jobs were created? It's just we decide, in the book that we simply can't say because a lot of records are not available to us. That they're private companies, not publicly held. And Romney has said that he created more than 100,000 jobs, or helped create more than 100,000 jobs during his time at Bain Capital. Most of those he attributes to Staples. And as I mentioned, they had an investment in and cashed it out before Staples grew exponentially. So the founder of Staples is quoted in the book as saying it's fair for Romney to take credit for all those jobs ever created at Staples, because without Romney's help, maybe Staples would have never gotten off the ground. Other people say, wait a second, he was not there during a lot of the growth. So it depends on how you look at that equation. That's a long answer, but it's a good question, and one that I think is important to understand, because this is one of the primary things that Romney talks about in explaining why he should be qualified to be president.
Also, in what kind of skills he
Well, the skills that the partners talk about is his, like I mentioned, the deliberative skills. He is a spreadsheet geek. One of his aides is quoted in the book as saying that Romney is not a very notional leader. He's all about what the data are and what the data mean. I paraphrased a little bit, but the exact quote's in the book. So that is who he is. His aides would describe him as an analytical type person, for better or worse, and that gives you some insight also into his character. I mean, he is a numbers person. There are other politicians who want nothing to do with the numbers. They are all about different ways to connect with people. But clearly that's one of the things that Romney is known for.
Question over here.
Yes. Hi. Thanks.
Hi.
So my question is about him being Romney being a driven pragmatist, and his recent remarks and criticism of President Obama's response to the tragedy in Benghazi. How would you fit that into the tapestry of Mitt Romney and his sort of miscalculation of how that was going to land?
Right. Well, the premise of your question is it's a miscalculation, and I guess we'll only know that when the election's held and we see if people elect him or thought foreign policy that it was a strength of his or not. So, in fairness, we don't know that. Obviously, there's been a lot of criticism, including some within the Republican Party, that he jumped the gun and should not have issued this statement. And most of you probably know what this question refers to, but in our paper, The Globe, and in other papers, timelines were run just to try to, because this is so complicated, to make it clear what was going on. There was this protest in Egypt. There was a statement issued by the U.S. Embassy in Egypt. And after that statement was issued, but before the killings in Benghazi, the Romney campaign issued a statement at about 10:30 at night on 9/11, and it said, this is embargoed for release, basically in the first minute of 9/12, I guess, criticizing the Obama administration for what Romney saw as apologizing for U.S. interests in various ways. You know the story. By the time people heard about it, there had been the U.S. ambassador to Libya killed and 3 other Americans killed at the consulate in Benghazi. So when that was known, Mitt Romney then had this press conference, which some of you probably saw. I watched it as it was occurring, not live, but on television, because it seems to be one of the key moments of a campaign. And he didn't back away. He sort of doubled down and was very critical of President Obama. And one reason for this is that Romney's written 2 books. The first book's called Turnaround. The second book is called No Apology. And the thesis of that book, in part, is that President Obama is, quote, apologizing for America as he goes around the world, and including when Obama went to Egypt. So from the Romney campaign's point of view, they saw this statement from the embassy in Cairo, say what you will about it, and they felt it fit their narrative precisely. And so they showed a statement to Governor Romney. He approved it. It was released. Then the killings happened in Libya, and then Romney had his press conference. So as I mentioned, there's been criticism of this. The Romney campaign has stood by this. They really haven't backed down because Romney had this dramatic press conference. And their point is, from their point of view, is they believe that the overall situation in the Arab world is a failing of the Obama administration because of their criticism. So you have to believe that the overall criticism, it's not this one event, but from their point of view, I know what they're saying. Their advisors are saying, look, this shows why the Obama foreign policy is not successful, not just this one event, but all of the ways that the Arab Spring is unfolding in ways that are perceived negatively in the U.S. So that's where he was coming from. I'm not, as I say earlier, excusing him or saying it's good or it's bad, but they felt it fit into the no apology narrative.
Yeah,
Go ahead, Mark. Go ahead.
I want to follow up with another kind of foreign policy question. My sense, kind of a not very well-informed sense, maybe call it a hunch, is that Romney is closer to the more militant neoconservative wing of the Republican foreign policy establishment than the more cautious realist wing. Maybe we could associate those wings with like Bush Sr. on the realist cautious side and Bush Jr. on the militant neoconservative side. Does that ring true to you? And if so, why is that? What is it about Romney's background, his values, or his process in becoming the nominee that has brought him to that wing of the foreign policy establishment as opposed to the other one?
Right. Well, it's a very important question. From my experience, it's sometimes hard to know from what they say in a campaign when they can be more bellicose because they're not actually running things and seeing intelligence reports and so forth, then they may govern. So you remember when George W. Bush ran for president, he said he'd have a, quote, humble foreign policy. And then, of course, 9/11 happened, and his foreign policy couldn't be humble under anyone's estimation. And in retrospect, perhaps not enough questions were asked about his foreign policy experience because that became obviously the cornerstone of his presidency, how he responded and his decision to invade Iraq and so forth. When you look at Romney's foreign policy team, he does have some of the same advisors. He has other advisors. I have asked directly to the Romney campaign, would Romney call himself a neoconservative? And they've pushed back some on that, but clearly some of their views other people would characterize in that same way. Some people define being a neoconservative different. They don't all agree with each other about every single country. Clearly Romney has tried to make a point of saying that he would be stronger in support of Israel than President Obama. He said he would be tougher on Iran. But let me give you an example of why sometimes it's hard to parse exactly what he would do. And that is a story that I wrote some weeks ago about Romney's position in Syria. In Syria, Romney was very critical of President Obama for not doing more to help the rebels in Syria. However, Senator John McCain had called for a no-fly zone, for safe havens, but Romney had not been supportive of that. So he's at one point being critical of President Obama, but he's not as far as Senator John McCain who wanted no-fly zones and so forth that would obviously involve the U.S. more directly. I don't know if something's changed since I wrote that story and given what's happened, but that is an example of how sometimes if you look at the flat statement, Obama's bad on Syria, then you look, wait a second, you're not doing what McCain says is necessary to be effective in Syria. So looking a little bit deeper, that's what we obviously try to do. Once you're in office and you get the daily brief and you see what's happening, maybe your views will slightly change. We don't know who his Secretary of State would be if he's president or his national security advisor. That's very important. So, he has some advisors, John Bolton, for example, but he has other advisors as well. So, these are important questions, and it's why it's a very good thing there's going to be one debate just on foreign policy that hopefully will go a little bit further in addressing these questions.
Go ahead.
You described Mr. Romney as a very cautious person. For example, the example you gave was Bain Capital, that he needed reassurance. So running for the presidency of this country doesn't seem to reflect a very cautious person, because first it's not a done deal, and even if he gets elected at the general conditions, sustained success in the presidency is also not a done deal. So did he change, or what is his reassurance now, or what did trigger his decision this time?
I mean, obviously running for president, there's all sorts of risks involved, but you could be a parachutist and be a cautious parachutist. What I mean by that is he would say, I don't want to speak for him, but his associates would certainly say that it's about having considered judgments. That's why, this question that this young lady asked about the statement regarding Libya and Egypt, was that too quick? And that's what some people in the Republican Party had said. This was a pretty quick statement, out of the box. The way they generally portray it is that he would be cautious in the sense of being more considered. He says he likes nothing more than to examine the data. One of his favorite things is to go through spreadsheets and examine the data and go through different formulas and seeing how things worked out. This is what he did on healthcare, going through this again and again. So, obviously he is running for the presidency, but he did so in a considered way. And then when he failed in 2008, they had a meeting where they discussed, why did we fail? What went wrong? What should we change? Sort of classic, around the table discussion. So that's sort of what I mean about that. Obviously, as president, there are some decisions you have to make, pretty quickly, but, every decision, is amplified, obviously, if you're president. So, there are some questions that we won't know unless he becomes president. But that is my sense about what the campaign would say in response to your question, and what we know of him. He's tried to be scripted. He's tried to be careful in some cases, but also, when you're running a campaign, you want to see what sticks. And sometimes effective campaign tactics are to make a particular charge, and they felt this would be effective. They saw an opportunity, and one of their mantras is to be able to jump quickly on that. In this case, maybe it backfired. We'll just have to see.
Question over here on the side.
Yes. So we know that Romney, however wrong, believes that the work requirement should remain in welfare. And we know that he thinks that he's not worried about the extreme poor because of their safety net. Those were two big quotes that or storylines that came out. And I with the new statistics on the poverty line not changing, still being around 15.1%, hopefully the conversation will move to poverty in America more so, perhaps. What do you feel Romney's stance on entitlements, the social safety net, welfare in America is, in particular to when he says that he would allow his faith to influence his presidency?
Well, he doesn't say that his faith will determine his decisions. To the contrary, he picks up the John F. Kennedy line about how he will not take, orders from the people who are the head of his religion. His faith, we could talk about it in a separate question, but clearly he's influenced himself by his faith. He's a religious Mormon, there's no question about that. But more specifically on your question about poverty, which is a really important question, remember in the campaign he made the comment about not being worried about the very poor and talking about how they had a safety net. And he got flack, obviously, from the left, for talking in this way, that there are all sorts of people who are poor, that he should be, it sounded like he was being callous. But he also got flack from the right, saying you shouldn't be talking about a safety net, you should be talking about a trampoline. And from the Republican viewpoint, and from the Romney campaign viewpoint, Right now, I mean, now that they've had time to think about it and not give an off-the-cuff answer that got Romney in some trouble during the primaries, clearly what Romney's talked about is his belief that entirely changing the tax code, entirely changing the way government is run, shrinking government, cutting tax rates, giving businesses more opportunities to do things as Romney sees them. Romney's view, obviously, is that would then benefit the poor, the very poor, and so forth. That's, Republican thinking, pretty mainstream right now. So that's why some people were saying they should stop talking about a safety net and start talking about a trampoline. So it's a different matter if you're talking about other plans to, give certain grants and so forth to people. Clearly Romney's saying that, what we consider the safety net would be there, and his viewpoint would be entirely changing the way we have a government, would be beneficiary. President Obama's campaign obviously would very much disagree with that approach. But that's sort of what's underlying the difference. It's not that either side doesn't care about the poor, despite what, the way Romney put it. It's about, what would their approach bring to people in all sectors of society and who would really benefit the most. And that's the vision that people have to look at from both campaigns in deciding who to vote for.
Question over here.
My question is a follow-up to the issue of religion and politics. Specifically, to what degree do you think that revelation, a primary dynamic in the Latter-day Saint tradition, plays a role in Mitt Romney's life? And secondly, what do we know and what are reporters doing to try to find out the dynamic of decision-making within the 12 apostles and among the prophets, specifically discussions potentially between religious leaders and Romney that pertain to politics?
Well, Mitt Romney has said, as I mentioned before, that he wouldn't take dictates from the church, that he is a Mormon, but that he is not taking dictates. So that's the way he's answered it. And he's gotten upset in some cases. There's video of him, getting upset with some questioners who asked the sort of question, how strongly will you be guided? He says he won't be, that he's a Mormon running for president and doesn't intend to be a Mormon president, if you will. But he is certainly a devoted Mormon. He said that his Mormon faith is, quote, one of the most important treasures of my life, quote unquote. So there's no question that for him personally, it's a very big part of who he is. And I believe you can't understand who Mitt Romney is unless you understand how important his faith is to him personally. So in the book, I write a chapter about the history of the Mormon Church and how that's intertwined with the Romney family history. And there's a chapter about his time as a church leader in Boston and so forth. So we do think it's important to talk about how this faith has changed him. And we note that he says that, this is who he is, but that he wouldn't take dictates from the church, and he doesn't always agree necessarily with various positions of the church.
Can I follow up on his question and ask you one thing from your book, but also something more generally? It is the case, though, it seems to me, that as you said, he's grown up in these series of bubbles, and one of them is the Mormon Church, because we don't know very much about it. It does seem like in this election season, on the one hand, it's getting a lot of attention. On the other hand, it's being treated very hands-offish. And there hasn't been a lot of discussion of the second part of his question, which is, what is the governance structure of this organization that you say is so important to him? So I wonder if you could reflect on that. And the second thing that's in your book is, you also write in your book, you go back a ways in his family history. Mm-hmm. And you talk about the great-grandfathers and what they did in Mexico and all. You're about the only person that seems to have talked about that. So I wonder if you could explain why that was important and why you think that's so explosive to now.
Well, I don't know if I use the word explosive, but it is. I think it's important to understand the history of where a candidate developed. So when I wrote some years ago about John Kerry, I spent a good amount of time researching the background, the family history of John Kerry. This is not unique to Mitt Romney. And to make a long story very, very short, what I found in the case of John Kerry, and we reported in 2003, was that Kerry's grandfather was not a Kerry, that his name was Cohn. He was raised in Europe, in Czechoslovakia, Austria, and they were persecuted because of their Jewish faith, and they changed their name to Kerry and changed their religion to Catholicism. And John Kerry himself didn't know some of this for many, many, many years. And I wrote a story about it, and we wrote about it in our book, and so forth. And he thought, when we talked about it with him, that that it was very interesting and that it helped answer some questions about his own family history. And I think it helps you understand better. I don't want to exaggerate the importance of it, but if you're writing a biography, this is a full-scale biography from beginning to the day that we end it. It is important to understand where a person's coming from. I would want to know my own background. Anybody curious about themselves and their place in the world, I would hope is curious about their own ancestry and would spend some time, much easier today than it was some years ago when I was researching my own family history, for example, and try to understand what your ancestors went through, maybe only a couple of generations back, to come to this country and to give you all perhaps opportunities you might not otherwise have had. So I just feel that's an important thing to know. So after having done the Kerry research, my editor said, why don't you do the same thing for the Romney family history? Basically the short version of it is that the Romney family history is intertwined with the Mormon faith. Mitt's great-great-grandfather, Miles Romney, was living in England, heard a Mormon missionary come there, and believed that Mormonism was the true faith, and changed his religion, came to Nauvoo, Illinois, the center of the Mormon faith in this country at that time, and where he got to know Joseph Smith, the founder of Mormonism. So, as I say, there was quite an intertwining there. And then this gentleman, this emigre's son, Miles Park Romney, is the great-grandfather of Mitt Romney. Miles Park grew up just as Mormon faith was really booming in the West in this country. And he eventually, as he was told to do by Mormon leaders at the time, had several wives. And then when polygamy was banned in this country, he was told, Mitt's great-grandfather, to go to Mexico, found a colony where polygamy could continue, and that's what his great-grandfather did. That colony, later on, the Romneys stopped practicing polygamy, but the Romneys continued to live in this colony, and in fact, that's where Mitt's father, George, was born. And when I was given this assignment in 2007, I only knew vaguely about the background of George Romney, and I didn't realize at the time that he'd been born in Mexico, because of course I knew he'd run for US president. So I had the opportunity to go to this place in Mexico. It's a very beautiful, small village in the mountains in Mexico, about 4 hours from El Paso. And to this day, there are many Romney cousins, people named Romney, in this village. And there's a big Mormon church there. So it's just, to me, as an historian, a very interesting story. I describe it as the wagon wheels in the ruts, westward ho story of the Romney canon. That tells you something about, take what you will about, whether you think that's a good thing or a bad thing, but clearly to do what they did. And I relied for that research on hundreds of letters, diaries, journals kept by Romney family members, by Mitt's particularly great-grandmothers from that period, who kept these extraordinary accounts of their time, what they had to go through. They were fleeing federal forces in the U.S. to go to Mexico. They were on the run. They were constantly taking flight and showed great determination in rebuilding. So the way I characterize in the book is that it is a story of flight, determination, rebuilding, and may help you understand to some degree, where the Romney verb comes from. George Romney was born in this colony. He had to flee when there was a revolution in Mexico when he was 5 years old, and then came to this country, relatively poor, and then the Romneys built themselves up. And it was that put Mitt Romney in position to be the person he is today, have a pretty easy, easier life, obviously, than a lot of his ancestors did. But without what they did, there probably would be no Mitt Romney running for president today. So, understanding that full story in a full-scale biography, I thought it was an interesting story to tell. Again, the part of your question about, what does certain people in the church say and will they direct Mitt Romney? I can only repeat, what Romney says is that, he does not want to be a, quote, Mormon president. He wants to be a Mormon who's running for president. Clearly he's proud of that fact, but that he wouldn't base his decisions on what the faith says. Those faith, principles guide him in certain ways, obviously, as the faith of anyone does, who is a believer of their faith. So I think that's the best I can tell you. I know it's probably not exactly the answer you're looking for, but as I say, the job of a biographer, we're trying to tell, a full-length story, and the history of the church and Romney family, that is part of the full story.
Got a question right here on the end. Oh, he's going to go. Okay. Wait, let's go where the mic is here.
I'm intrigued by your characterization of Romney as a driven pragmatist who is able to bring together through, say, a spreadsheet, which of course is one way of organizing data, all these data that he then considers making a decision. I think what we've seen in looking at Romney is he's been very successful in what's essentially a binary decision in the business world. Will this investment make money or not? How will he do with this habit of mind and these spreadsheets if and when he's president and he's confronted with decisions that are not binary, that are very much multivariable and that change instantly, much like we've seen in the past couple of days? You know, it's no longer, yes, this makes money, no, this doesn't, where he's been successful. It's like, how do I get through the next couple of days and not start a war? I think that's a different kind of decision.
Yeah, I understand the question. The question goes to sort of what we've been talking about who he is and what is really his principles are. And his aides, I mean, clearly have said time and again that he is a data-driven person. I don't know that they would then, go so far as to say that's the only thing that he relies on. I know that they wouldn't, do that. What's interesting is that the answer to this question in part is in what he did in healthcare in Massachusetts. And in that case, he talked a lot about being concerned about people who didn't have insurance, trying to find a way to solve that problem. As we've discussed, it's not something that has been a favorite topic of his in the primaries, but from his point of view, from his thinking, that was an example of being empathetic, of trying to help out people who, can't afford insurance on their own without help from the government and so forth. He's obviously gotten a lot of criticism for that, but that's something what we can look at. We've talked about the business decisions, and obviously, his job was to make a profit for the investors. But he was in Massachusetts, obviously viewed as a relatively pragmatic governor, working with a very democratic legislature. It's hard for me to stand here and say, based on what he's done, here's a decision he would make in a certain crisis. What I do think is the reason we do a book like this is to give you a full sense of his character, to give you a full sense of how he's addressed, crises and various things throughout his life, and how he's reacted to those. We can only base it, on what he's done and how. That's why we try to tell a full story. It's a little hard for me to summarize off the top of my head in a lecture like this, but I've tried to give you a sense about how we really, try to lay out what he's done and what he's done throughout his life. Obviously there's changes or contradictions, and we're unflinching about that. We try to describe that, in the greatest detail. It's up to you, really to make that decision based on, your thorough reading of the book and watching, him talk and other things like that. That's our job, is to, we presented the book and our reporting to try to give people all the information that we possibly can, in a cogent, hopefully readable way.
Got a question right here.
This is a question you may not want to answer because of your profession, but after your considerable research and extensive exposure to Romney, would you seriously consider voting for him for president?
Yeah, I don't answer questions like that because my whole point is that I'm an objective, hopefully independent reporter. That's my job. And I don't even tell my family who I vote for. It's just as a reporter, old-fashioned mainstream reporter, that's just where I'm coming from. And I know that if you turn on, a cable news channel where people are spouting off opinions, and you may not realize that that's the opinion columnist, not the reporter from that publication, but that's my job. And if I answer that question, I'd be basically violating what my job. I've really tried, as you can tell sometimes from an occasionally strained answer, is that, when I write it out, we write it out carefully, trying to present the best information. And people do ask me, okay, based on what you know, what would you do? And I have to give them this, this answer. It's just that's the book we're doing. If we wrote a different kind of book, that would be a different matter, and maybe we'd sell more copies because it had a strong point of view. But that was the assignment we had, and I really, try to keep to that.
Can I just add here? I'm going to add something here. My co-teacher in a course that we taught for many years, The Press in American Democracy, Charlotte Grimes, former colleague of his in Washington for the St. Louis Post-Dispatch, is the night chair of political reporting here. She goes one step beyond Michael. Charlotte refuses to vote. She's not registered to vote. She does not vote in order to protect her independence.
Yeah.
She never wants to be saying she's got a dog in this fight.
Yeah.
That's the great tradition of American professional journalism. Now, we can poo-poo it all we want, but in my view, it serves us well. We're to make the judgments. They're to try to give you the best of what they found under all the rocks.
And there's debate. There are people in the industry who will say you shouldn't register, you shouldn't vote. Other people say you have an obligation to be as independent as you can, but to pretend that you have no view whatsoever. Maybe that's not realistic, and you shouldn't give up your right to vote. There's just, people have differing views. There's some years, frankly, where I haven't voted for that reason, and then people will say, wait a second, you're all about democracy and so forth. So there's a little back and forth. The bottom line is, is someone so pure that they have no opinion whatsoever about anything? But their journalist training is to put on those blinders and to constantly ask the question, what's the opposite point of view? What's the argument against that? What's the fair way to say that? Is that fair? So I do that. Editors do that. When I'm talking freely, I'm trying to be, fair and careful in what I say. But that's the bottom line, is that whatever your view, whether you should or you shouldn't, as an old-fashioned journalist, you want to, filter out your own personal views, whatever they may be, if you have them, and still present, an unbiased judgment.
We're going to take two more questions, one up at the back and then over here. Go ahead.
Hi, I'm over here.
He's over here.
After having spent years and countless hours investigating and reporting on Romney and other political figures, how do you personally disconnect from Romney? Because I would imagine that as a researcher, you inevitably feel some kind of link or connection. And as an unbiased reporter, how do you do that, if you can do that? And how do you balance your inclination toward Romney and, your ear catches something in the news, oh, Romney, like what's going on there, with your duty to report?
Well, it's an interesting question. My inclination is, my link is to telling, a fair story. And this is not a book that I undertook because I'm pro or anti. Right. It's just not. So as a result, what I'm interested in doing is, what's the real story? What's the full story? And so we spent a lot of time, as I mentioned earlier, going through all of these Bain deals and using a spreadsheet, going through all the deals and putting them and finding, hey, there's this one deal I've never heard of. What's the Italian Yellow Pages? That's what really interests me. That further illuminates the story. It doesn't mean that I have a connection. In one way, I have a connection as a reporter to my desire to write and find out. Nothing interests me more in a lot of ways than the journey of discovery. So as a reporter, what I love is sort of like, going back to Encyclopedia Brown, which I read as a kid, is like, well, gee, I found this clue. What's the answer? What happened here? How did they make us money? Oh, there's this deal. That may say something. And as a reporter, that really gets me going. And then, I want to see, what do people say about that? How do we then tell the story? There's many layers of what I try to do that I think is part of a journalist's job. I don't want to just throw information out there that's unreadable. I want to spend time also making it extremely readable. It's a different thing when I approach the project about Thomas Jefferson. That is that was a labor of love because, I know this man is a bundle of contradictions. He's endlessly fascinating because he is so contradictory. It's just an accepted thing at the outset, and trying to illuminate and understand, what made him the person he is. And I decided to write that book because I felt that this explained, part of who he was, because he authored the Declaration, yet had to take flight from the British, wasn't a good war governor at all, and yet later ran for the presidency. All of that really interested me. It doesn't mean that, I think he's the be-all. I think, I thought the story was just incredibly interesting, and my job as a storyteller and reporter was to try to tell that story. So it's sort of the same thing here. My editors know that I have an interest in delving in and to telling a story and so forth. So if you're not a journalist or, what I do, it may be a little hard to understand, but I do have the story is there, and I'm trying my best to understand, the true story of what happened and then tell it, in an interesting way and in a compelling way. In the end, obviously, there are judgments that we do make that are just, for example, he's changed positions. I don't have to walk around that. He has. The question is why. But, would he be the right person or the wrong person? That's what we wrote this book so you can have better information to decide that for yourself.
Last question here.
Hello. We've been talking a lot about independent journalism, and you've just mentioned that you're really trying to get your stories across in the most readable way. So I was wondering, how would you assess the appetite of the American public for the type of journalism that you are portraying or representing? Like, who is your audience, your public outside this auditorium?
Mm-hmm.
And also, maybe did Mitt Romney read your book?
I don't know for sure. I know his aides have, a number of them have read the book, and they told me they thought it was fair. There's certainly things that they would have written differently, but they, know our reputation and know, despite their complaints with the Boston Globe over the years, we've been told that they thought it was a fair book. As far as who the audience is, our hope is that the audience is someone who wants to be an educated and interested and informed voter. If we wanted, if all we cared about was selling copies, we could have written a book, make your own title up, and you can look on the bestseller list. Some of the books that are the best-selling about candidates are those that have a very, very strong slant one way or the other. That would have been an easier way to go, frankly. This is a product of the Boston Globe, although my name's on it, my co-author's name's on it. They're the ones who, in the end, put it out through HarperCollins. We told them that there'll be a certain number of people who will be interested in this. This is going to be a down-the-middle book. So if someone's looking to reinforce view X or view Y, maybe they'll want to read this to learn about it. But we're really looking, with this, maybe it's naive, but this hope that, for such an important decision, people want to know about who this person is. What I have found is that a lot of presidential candidates, they write their own books. I had one Romney aide say to me, "Why are you writing this book? Romney's already written 2 books of his own." Well, those books are, his own version of his history, and he doesn't provide a lot of personal detail. The first sentence in chapter 1 of his book, No Apology, I'm not making this up, the first sentence is, quote, "I hate to weed," unquote. That's the first sentence of his book. You have to go on and read it. But, it's different. He's telling a story from his viewpoint, and we're trying to tell, a story without a slant or a viewpoint. So, it's a fair question. The publisher decided that there'd be enough people that they wanted to, buy the book and publish it. So, that's the best answer I can give you.
Do you know how many people, how many books have you sold so far?
I don't know exactly, but it's in paperback, and they just went in after 3 weeks to have a 4th printing, and it was sold out on Amazon for 2 weeks. So that tells me a number of people are trying to buy it. Is that as many books are as people trying to buy, a book called The Amateur about Obama? No, of course not. But that's heartening. It shows that there's been a fair amount of interest, because a lot of people, even though I've been, writing about Romney, others have been writing about Romney for years, it's understandable. A lot of people still have questions. I've tried to give you the best I can snapshot answers, but really the answer is we've tried to provide, is in writing this book. And one audience I know is journalists. It seems like every journalist I talk to has said, they've read the book, and I see lots of stories that clearly people have read the book, and sometimes they credit the book and so forth. And there's no other full-scale biography. So if we haven't done this, I don't know what other book there would be out there that is full-scale. Not trying to sound self-promotional, but that was the thinking. There was no other group or person in a position to write this other than the Boston Globe. So really, it's a tribute to my newspaper that they were willing to give us the time and the resources to try to write this book.
Well, we are grateful to you and the Globe that you wrote it, and also grateful that you came here and shared your thoughts about it with us. So thank you very much, Michael.
Thank you very much.
We tried to push you and figure it out, but you escaped. Just a reminder, the reception is in the public events room at Eggers, 220 Eggers. So follow us up there, and we'll continue the conversation.